Okay.
So, this is me hoping I packed all the right things for Southeast Asia. It was November, but looking at the temperatures over there, I just knew that it looked hot. So I packed some t-shirts and some sunscreen and I crossed my fingers. Why Southeast Asia? Well, I watched too many movies and any movie that showed these countries always stood out to me. Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So, would I recognize anything from these movies, or would my expectations be shattered?
And we'll see how it goes.
Plans were almost immediately disrupted when my flight was canceled the morning I was supposed to fly out.
So the plane that's coming to get me is arriving here at 6:12 p.m. and taking me away from here at 5:39 p.m. Explain that. They must know that my flight is already going to be delayed.
And this didn't bode well for me. I'm a creature of habit and routine, so it was a brutal reminder that flexibility would be a necessity when traveling.
There's confusion. You know when the person at the counter has to call a number and then they're on hold? That's never a good sign. But I'm through security. I have a ticket to Tokyo and a ticket from Tokyo to Hanoi.
I lined up at the help desk, I started making phone calls, and eventually I was rerouted from Qatar to Istanbul. But when that didn't work out, I was rerouted again from Istanbul through Tokyo.
Couple things. The airport food in Tokyo, it's banging. Got some ramen. Another thing I noticed, most American flights, when you recline your chair to be in a more comfortable position, there's the moral question. Do I scrunch the person behind me by doing this, forcing them to lean their chair back, and then making a cluster all the way to the back of the plane? Or do I just sit upright in pain the entire time? This flight, don't know if it was because it was a Japanese airline, instead of reclining your seat backwards, your legs move forward, so you still end up reclined. But now the question is, am I willing to cramp my own legs to get the reclined position? Pretty fascinating stuff.
I made the best of it. I ate some ramen at the Tokyo airport, and I made it to Hanoi, Vietnam, a little after midnight.
Got about 5 hours of sleep. Today, I'm going to be going down, seeing what's for breakfast. And then we're getting on some sort of junk boat, they call it. And going out for a day on that. I'm going to spend the night on it. I'm going to have some seafood, I hear. I'm pretty excited. I'm also pretty hungry. So I'm going to get out of here.
I hadn't traveled in a while, and stepping out of the hotel in the morning was that beautiful feeling of absolute culture shock. What's normal? What's not? There was no way for me to know. But on the bus ride to Ha Long Bay, every mundane aspect of normal Vietnamese life was an overwhelming barrage of confusion for my American brain. I spent much of the ride leaving Hanoi just hoping not to see any of the scooter drivers wipe out, but somehow, like a ballet of two-wheeled dancers, some invisible system, appearing to myself as complete chaos, guided them through every intersection and roundabout. As we drove through the country, our guide told us that people would traditionally bury their loved ones twice, once maybe by the foot of the mountains, and then a few years later, the bones would be dug up and moved to a traditional grave in the family's rice fields so they could be nearby. As we reached Ha Long Bay and set out on our accommodation for the night, a junk boat, the natural beauty was overshadowed by legends. Long ago, I was told, the people of Vietnam were being invaded by an army from the sea. They asked for help from an army of dragons, and after the dragons vanquished the attackers, they shed their giant teeth into the ocean, creating the thousands of limestone islands to make a natural barrier to prevent future invasions. The next day, we visited a cave, and just like the bay itself, it was also filled with legends. Stories of a tiny boy who stopped growing at the age of 5 until he ate all the rice in the village and became a towering warrior. And another story of a woman who was banned to an island after refusing the proposal of a rich man. She turned to stone, and when her true love found her, he turned to stone as well. These were beautiful, universal stories, and as I took in the natural beauty of the bay, I began to really appreciate just how little I knew about where I was. These were people who grew up on completely different lore, different myths, different history, and I had no idea how I'd even begin to understand the culture I was in. So it's a good thing that after arriving back in Hanoi, again without seeing any scooter riders wipe out, I was given the opportunity to go on a foodie tour. I've never been somewhere in the world where people didn't appreciate the experience of food with friends and family, so it was the perfect way for me to get a taste of the Vietnamese lifestyle. While our tour guide maneuvered us through the busy streets, I had not yet become accustomed to the traffic situation.
This doesn't seem like I should be walking here, but that's where I'm being told to go. So that's where I'm going.
But despite the illusion of chaos, nobody was hurt, and our guide took us for noodles, pancakes, sandwiches, and the fabled egg coffee I'd heard about, which turned out to be the richest, coffeeiest, hot chocolate-tasting beverage I'd ever had.
Coffee that we roast right here at our field.
After a wild first couple days in Vietnam, it was already time to head south. So we hopped on a sleeper train for a 14-hour ride to the city of Hue. A feverish night on a hard bed, being massaged to sleep by the old railroad. And outside the window, constantly changing impressions of a world I still knew almost nothing about. On our first day in Hue, we took a tour of the imperial city, and I had sudden flashes of familiarity. How on the other side of the world from where I grew up was I having flashbacks from high school? And that's when I began to piece together the fiction of my youth and some of the reality on which it was based. These stones memorialized in movies and games throughout time. As light rain started, we took shelter in the gatehouse, and as I listened to the history of the place, I thought about the Nguyen Emperor who made the city the capital of Vietnam over 220 years ago. I thought about the workers who built all the fortifications brick by brick. They would never be able to comprehend that centuries later a teenager from the United States would take shelter behind the very brick they'd placed in some virtual recreation of a future war which would change the course of history for everyone involved. Despite never having been to the place, I started to understand the significance of these images from an American perspective. The Vietnam War didn't just shape military policy moving forward, it really shaped U.S. culture. Some of the greatest American music ever recorded grew out of the passionate feelings people had about the misguided conflict. And it's no coincidence that the civil rights movement in America saw major strides at the time either. I mean, how would it feel to be a young black soldier swept up in the draft and sent to fight in a war they didn't understand? Arguments could be made that their participation in particular, fighting for a country in which racial inequality was so rampant, made very little sense. The month after the battle for Hue ended, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And somehow I felt like the bullet which killed him and the bullets which ripped through these walls around me were connected in some weird way. As a kid, just watching movies and playing games years after the facts, I felt an unmistakable weight of this conflict. I could feel that it was an important moment in history, but it was only now, standing in the actual places a couple decades later, that I finally started to put together some of the pieces and understand why. After seeing the Imperial Palace, we stopped by a pagoda, and in a small, nondescript building nearby, an old chunky blue car seemed out of place, but then I saw the picture on the wall behind it. The image of Buddhist monk Thich Van Duc sitting peacefully covered in flames is ingrained in my mind, probably originally from a high school history class. But while the image always stood out, the context escaped me. I like learning about history, I like reading about it, I like watching videos about it. I'd read about Duc and how he was protesting against the persecution of Buddhists at the time under the rule of a US-backed South Vietnamese Roman Catholic ruler. But, words are just words and videos are videos. It really was different standing in front of the car Duc drove to the location, seeing the hood he popped to pull out the gas canister, and even feeling that oppressive Vietnamese heat and humidity that he probably felt in June of 1963. I love a moment like that takes something I'm vaguely aware of and humanizes it so quickly. But despite the intense modern history of Vietnam, there's a levity as well. That evening I went out for a drink at a bar called the DMZ, themed entirely around the war and highlighting Hue's proximity to that line of demarcation between the North and the South.
I was just at a bar called the DMZ. Very, very adorable little place. Got some scooters coming up behind me here. Always a scooter coming up behind you.
The next day, we went on a scooter tour. But since driving ourselves in that traffic would be a recipe for our own death, we did have drivers. We were shown how rice is traditionally processed. We visited a local market. And near the end of the tour, we visited a kind of 2-century-old coliseum where elephants and tigers would fight for the entertainment of spectators.
A lot of tigers died here.
That's so sad.
A lot of good tigers.
I asked who won, and I was told always the elephant. The elephant, I guess, represented the ruling family at the time, and as such, the tigers were declawed before the fight, more or less guaranteeing the outcome. Afterward, we took a bus south through Hai Van Pass, translating as Ocean Cloud Pass for obvious reasons. We went past the large city of Da Nang and into the city of Hoi An.
Hey, look at this. Look at this. We're in Hoi An. We're in Hoi An. Beautiful city. Beautiful ride on the way here.
A town with a wonderfully preserved old downtown, and a town which must be the lantern capital of Vietnam. Past all the tailors and restaurants, the river just lights up at night with thousands of traditional lanterns in a hypnotic display of color and energy. The next morning, we took a bicycle tour of the nearby area, and just outside town, it was surprising how quickly we were able to ride from the bustling city streets to the quiet rice fields and farms of the country. Given the communist history of the government and economy, I was told that citizens can ask for a small plot of land on which to grow food. They can eat the food or sell it, and they don't pay taxes on the property. We watched locals tend to their crops. We tried some locally brewed alcohol, which was intensely strong as expected, and then took a ride on a traditional basket boat. This is a good time to mention just how many tourists seem to visit the city of Hoi An. Due to the affordable tailors, at which I did buy a suit for an upcoming wedding I'm attending, the plethora of delicious foods, the historical preservation of the downtown, and the general beauty of the location itself, Hoi An draws huge crowds. I asked where most of these tourists come from and was told they see many Koreans and Taiwanese. Apparently, they mostly stay in nearby Da Nang, and they come to Hoi An in the afternoon, creating huge crowds between 4 and 9 p.m. I definitely noticed how quiet the streets got once these tourists retreated on their buses back to Da Nang. But as our basket boat turned a corner, the familiar sound of Gangnam Style filled the air, and the evidence of Korean tourists was unmistakable. Our remaining time in Hoi An was peaceful, beautiful, filled with good food, historical sightseeing, and cheap massages. As somebody who has never had a professional massage due to not wanting to pay a lot of money for something I might not even find comfortable, the offer of a $15 1-hour massage seemed like a good opportunity to try the experience. And great news, it was very relaxing. Although I'm now spoiled and do not want to pay the prices I see back in America. So, after a few days in the lovely city of Hoi An, we took a bus to Da Nang and hopped on a flight to finish our trip south to the city of Ho Chi Minh, or as many locals still call it, Saigon. On arriving in Saigon, we took a tour using traditional cyclos. They're weird little contraptions, mostly used for tourists, but with so many interesting sights being in such a contained area of downtown, they're a fun method of transportation that goes slow enough to really allow you to take in the sights. Following up on the history we saw in Hue, we saw the square where the monk Duke performed his act of protest. We then visited a hideout where Viet Cong saboteurs would hide. This far south, Americans were still far from safety, with many Ho Chi Minh supporters staying in the area during the war, transporting weapons in secret and hiding out, waiting for opportunities to attack before rushing back to the safety of the hideout.
Yeah, this is a secret hiding space for us VC. Here's where we study our map and we plan our next moves. You can see here. Nobody knows we're in here. It's very safe.
Wow.
Yeah. I hope I don't have to use this.
One thing I noticed while touring around was just how developed this city was. Compared to historical Hue and the well-preserved Hoi An, Saigon was clearly a hub of globalization. That night, we ate at a street food market where you could get great Vietnamese food, Thai food, or even Italian or Greek. I ordered a giant spicy fish and filled up before bed, as I knew the next day would provide a rich historical experience. The Gu Chi tunnels, about 30 miles north of Saigon, was just one network of tunnels scattered throughout the country, but due to its proximity to Saigon and its massive scope reaching 75 miles in length, it was particularly important in the purposes of transporting soldiers and weapons throughout the region. We arrived in the morning, and as we were given a tour of the area, feelings of visiting tourists seemed to be mixed. Everyone found the site to be interesting, with recreations of traps, the showcases of the Viet Cong living conditions, and of course the tunnels themselves.
They got the tunnel entrance and then it comes right into the hospital. I'm going to take a look at this tunnel. Yeah. I would not be a good Viet Cong.
But the vibe was also strange, and in some ways felt celebratory. In a place with so much suffering, so many decades of death, there was an odd, almost Disney-esque vibe to some of the presentation. I suppose Vietnam's victory may have contributed to the metamorphosis of this place into the odd spectacle it is today. I really hope I keep this experience in mind as I visit historical sites in the future. As an American, I'm used to a few basic perspectives and historical lenses. America either enslaves or commits genocide, or it fights evil and polices the world. But in both of these story arcs, America is kind of the winner. Visiting a place where America suffered such a long, slow, public defeat resulted in an enlightening experience, but also a fascinating divergence from the narratives more commonly known and recited back home. Afterward, I felt I might need a more grounded perspective, so on returning to Saigon, I visited the War Museum, and throughout its 4 floors, I found more of the reverence I expected. I was also surprised at some of the images and information. As somebody who has a degree in history education and who has a particular interest in this period, it's interesting that some of the stories and details had eluded me until now. This is something I often find while traveling, I guess. The stories we're told aren't necessarily untrue, but they're very incomplete. Not necessarily for any conspiratorial reason, but just perhaps because some history is difficult to talk about and hard to confront. I also took note in the display dedicated to the American use of the chemical Agent Orange of a detail explaining the damage the chemical dealt to U.S. soldiers as well. I sense no animosity here for the U.S. soldiers. Despite the human rights violations that certainly took place, the American soldiers were portrayed more as the confused kids they were than a pack of killers. That evening, I had a drink and looked out at how far Vietnam has come since the end of the war. Its population booming to 100 million, Saigon's skyline filling up with sparkly towers. Such a contrast to the history I'd been poring over all morning, I couldn't help but think about the resilience of our species, how quickly societies adapt. We had one more day in the area, so we took a trip down to the Mekong Delta. Massive network of rivers covering over 15,000 square miles, an area larger than the state of Maryland. Between boats, tuk-tuks, and canoes, we visited a local honey producer, a traditional candy factory, and we stopped for snacks, where we were serenaded by traditional musicians. I asked what one of the instruments was called and how much it cost. The man apparently didn't know how much it cost because he had built his. We stopped for lunch, and I was given the opportunity to drink what I will just call snake wine for obvious reasons.
Thanks, Doc.
Yeah, go ahead, bro. It's amazing.
Hey, one for you too.
I'm not sleeping tonight.
Yeah.
It's so super strong, you know. Ooh, this. Okay. Wait, hold on. Yeah, that is it. Okay. 1, 2, 3, vô. 1, 2, 3, vô. 1, 2, 3, vô.
With a brain full of new historical context and a belly full of snake wine, and the sound of traditional music in my ears, it was time to leave Vietnam and head west, into a country I knew much less about, Cambodia. While I did notice the terrain change on the bus ride to Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, I noticed other smaller changes. The types of vehicles on the road, the number of scooters, the age of the vehicles, the architecture and spacing of the houses. Even just watching the scenery pass by the bus window, it was clear things were a little different. Once again, we were introduced to the city via cyclo. After seeing the Independence Monument, the sun began to set and we passed the Imperial Palace. Looking more closely, the curved points on top of the traditional and official buildings are actually all in the shape of snakes, which I would find out later are a very important animal in Cambodia. After our tour, a local family cooked us dinner at their house, and as I often think when I see home-cooked meals in other countries, how is restaurant-quality food being made at home in these places? Near the end of dinner, we discovered the father of the house was actually going to be our guide the next day, when we visited the killing fields. On the ride back to the hotel, I wondered what that experience would be like. Vietnam has its share of dark history, but Vietnam also gained its freedom. In a way, there was a victory. I didn't know much about Cambodia, but I did know that in the late 1970s, there were no victors here. Our guide from the night before outlined the history for us on the way to the killing fields. I knew the basic story from books and movies, the way Pol Pot swept into Phnom Penh with the Khmer Rouge and initiated an instantaneous restructuring of the society, sending everyone to spend the next almost 4 years farming rice in brutal conditions. Well, that's what happened if they were lucky. But if I'd learned anything in Vietnam, it's that learning the history from a book is different from seeing the sights in person. The killing fields reinforced that idea even more dramatically. As our guide walked us through the mass graves, pointing out details and providing more historical context, I realized his age. He was a child during the era of the Khmer Rouge, and he was one of the children who worked in the rice fields. He had friends and family who weren't so lucky. Like most Cambodians at the time, at least 20% of the population of Cambodia found themselves in the killing fields eventually. At one point, we came to a tree, and he explained what the tree was used for.
I have to kill all the babies. You start to kill the mothers. Let the mothers see with their own eyes how all the babies will kill and kill them all after. See how cruel.
As he described what happened to the children who came to this place, I realized I was crying. As somebody who isn't particularly known for public displays of emotion, I hung back from the group for a few minutes, just reflecting on the place I was in. At the end of the tour, I entered the stupa, essentially a large public mausoleum, and I saw the bones of those who had been recovered at this particular site, all marked in the ways in which they'd been killed. Who had these people been? How had they found themselves in this place? What had they thought about what was happening? Well, after the tour, we had one more somber stop that day, the most active prison during the time, known as S21. A former high school, Pol Pot's regime turned it into an interrogation facility. The bottom rooms had been preserved had they were found, with a single bed fixed with shackles, and a table where the interrogators would put the typewriter to type out the names of your friends and family. That list of people would then find themselves in the same room later, facing the same torture and giving the same list of names. On the walls of each room were pictures of bodies. The final occupants of each room killed just hours before the Vietnamese army took the city back from the Khmer Rouge. The Vietnamese had documented things as a way to show the Cambodians what had been happening in the cities in the almost 4 years they'd been working in the fields. Of the possibly 20,000 people who came through S-21, only a handful were known to have survived, and only 2 of those adults are still alive. It was an honor to meet them, and even hearing the stories from their own mouths, I really couldn't imagine the reality of what they described. Afterward, I visited the Royal Palace, and while the architecture is beautiful, I remembered a detail I had read. The current king and the current prime minister both had fathers who were connected to the Khmer Rouge in different capacities. This was not really discussed in public, and public criticism of the king could, I was told, result in jail time. So, while there's still a darkness about Cambodian politics, there's also a real peace about this place as well. It was explained to me that revenge is not something the people of Cambodia are interested in. An overwhelmingly Buddhist country with over 95% of the population following Theravada Buddhism, peace appeared to be held in high regard. The true belief in karma and reincarnation really seemed to bring the people a sense of calm, a sense that while there was darkness in the world, as long as each person can control their own sense of happiness, things were okay. And as we left Phnom Penh for the ancient capital of Angkor Wat, I began to notice something about the Cambodian people, their smiles. Everywhere I went, people seemed happy to see me. With a wave, a bow, a smile, or a combination of the 3, I felt really welcomed in the country. Kids by the side of the road, smiles. Tuk-tuk drivers, smiles. This little girl offering me a tarantula, smile. I should mention these spiders are fried and eaten as a tasty snack. I was offered the chance to nibble on a leg, and you've always got to take the invitation.
Okay, this is tarantula leg. I'm about to eat a tarantula leg. It's not bad actually. It's like a potato chip.
On the way to Siem Reap, we stopped at a village on the edge of Tonle Sap, the largest freshwater lake in Southeast Asia, known as a floating village with approximately 10,000 residents. It was like experiencing the movie Waterworld in real life. Rarely do you see a community pushed by its environment to be such a departure from what you're used to, but this was a beautiful example. I couldn't imagine what their days were like. Floating churches, floating police stations, and everyone on boats, an economy built entirely around this massive lake. I wondered how long I would need to stay here to really begin to understand what life was like for these people. There was one main island on which they had a school, some shrines, and a marketplace.
So this is like a grocery store. It's selling for people living here, you know.
Shops, hair salons, mechanics,
Cigarettes.
and just as I'd seen everywhere else, plenty of smiles. The next morning, we woke up early, very early, and still half asleep, the sun began to rise and we could make out the absolute majesty of Angkor Wat. It still felt like we were dreaming, and I could totally understand the effect this structure must have had on people 900 years ago when it was built. Despite all the massive modern marvels I'd seen on this trip, nothing had been as beautiful as the sun coming up over Angkor Wat. And the inside was somehow even more impressive. You couldn't take a step without passing some intricately carved detail, a finely crafted relief. Before TV, before books, walking through this space must have felt out of this world. I was actually quite blown away that I could walk anywhere I wanted. Considering the beauty and craftsmanship, I'm sure it'll only be a matter of time before some barriers will have to be put up as Cambodia's tourism industry continues to grow. I remember as a child growing up in England being able to walk right up to Stonehenge, but that's not the case anymore. As a firm believer in the preservation of sites like this, I understand the purpose of those measures, but I always feel privileged when I visit a space like Angkor Wat at a time like this, when I can still get close enough to see the tiny marks made by some artisan all those centuries ago. I wondered if he felt a pride in seeing what he contributed to. As it turns out, Angkor Wat is just one of many incredible temples spread out throughout the nearby jungles.
This is the library, okay?
This library didn't make it. Sad day for libraries.
We visited Ta Prohm, also known as the Tomb Raider Temple, due to its depiction in the 2001 film with the same name. Our guide had worked at the hotel in which Angelina Jolie had stayed during filming, and he told me that tourism picked up dramatically after the release of that movie. Due to the temple having been built without mortar, trees took root in the loose stones after it was abandoned, creating the fascinating atmosphere it now has. The last temple of the day was the Bayon Temple, featured for about half a second in the very underrated film The Fall. Its most distinctive feature are the hundreds of stone faces carved into the many towers. The four-faced Buddha is a common sight around Cambodia, but the Bayon Temple was the most striking depiction of it to me. In those smiling faces, I saw the people of Cambodia, and our guide told me some like to think that the faces are smiling because the people who carved them have carved their own smiles into the rock. Images of the welcoming people I'd experienced throughout my time here. But it was also around this time that my body had had enough. Between the weird food, the lack of sleep, and generally overwhelming amount of new information I'd been experiencing, I came down with the flu and had to spend an afternoon in bed. Not wanting to waste my final days, however, I took an offer to go on a tuk-tuk tour to try some local street food. And this may have been a mistake. As adventurous as I try to be, my stomach wasn't having it. We did have some other stops that I tried my best to enjoy, like a visit to see how modern artisans carve the beautiful stone monuments we saw all over the country. I went to bed that night as the sun set over the rice fields, knowing I wouldn't make it on any tours the next day. I spent all day in bed, drinking the tea provided in all the hotel rooms, and by dinner I felt just enough recovered to make it out to a showcase of traditional dancing. A really fascinating display of culture. I knew that every little gesture meant something, but I was too ignorant and too tired to understand. Every twist of the wrist and bending of the hand was a centuries-old code, each with a significant meaning. But to my Western eyes, it was just a hypnotic meditation of discipline and grace. The next day, I had time to rest on the bus to Bangkok. By the time we stopped at a rest stop, I actually had a bit of an appetite, which was good, since food at the rest stop was actually quite tasty, and by Thai standards, very mild in terms of spice. We stayed in a hotel in Chinatown, and since I was out of clean clothes, I went searching for a shirt. Tailors had been so plentiful in Vietnam, but as I descended further and further into the markets, which stretched down every nook and cranny of every alley here, I couldn't find a shirt that was really what I was looking for.
Always tempted to go down the mysterious alley. The mysterious alleys are where you find the shops that sell mogwai. This I know to be true.
I ended up walking into a completely nondescript building only to find a full mall inside.
I appear to have found some sort of mall. Fascinating. How did I find it? How will I get out? No idea. Is she trying to get out? I don't know. These clothes. Are those clothes for sale? There's no one there. What a mysterious experience.
Later that evening, we had dinner, and I tasted a little bit of that Thai spice in the form of some fried squid stuffed with a spicy chicken. A farewell from Thailand that, while delicious, would prove to be a slight issue the next morning when I found myself in the bathroom. But no matter. The trip had come to an end. And as I sat in the airport with nothing to do but eat and think, that all too familiar feeling came creeping up. I'm always struck with an overwhelming feeling of sadness, like a bittersweet catharsis at the end of trips. At first I thought it was because, well, the trip was over and I was going home. That didn't make sense. Going home is nice. Home is comfortable, relaxing. So what is that feeling? Well, thinking about everything I'd done in the last 3 weeks, every person I'd met, every sight I'd seen, everything I'd tasted and smelled, I began to think that maybe going home makes me feel a bit like the character of Seth Brundle in the 1986 film The Fly. Well, stay with me here. As comfortable as home can be, it sometimes feels like a facade. Everything the same, everything convenient. Is that how life is supposed to be? Don't get me wrong, I'm very thankful to have a place to rest where I can just turn off and soak in the familiarity. But that constant, chaotic, confusing, exhausting reality of travel in some ways feels more like real life to me. It feels more like a human experience.
Now, do you go with Mr. Hot Dog or authentic Chinese cuisine right next to the Texas car park? Best not to ask questions in situations like this. Just accept and move on.
So like Seth Brundle, I think the sadness in the airport comes from dreaming for 3 weeks that I was a human. But now the dream is over and I'll be returning to my daily simple life as a fly. But if I'd taken anything from the Buddhists of Southeast Asia, it was that peace is important and life can ebb and flow. They believe people can die and be reborn in another life, another time and place. Well, at home, I'd be at peace, and I knew that maybe one day, this fly would get to dream again. Where would my dream take me? Well, I never really know, but the thought comforted me, and even as I edit this video, it continues to comfort me. So, until next time, world.
Cambodia in the bathroom. A motorcycle on the way to the bathroom? Ridiculous.